not save the 8 victims in Atlanta or the 10 last night, including a brave police officer. Thoughts and prayers can't save the 24,000 people killed every year, or the 26 blacks killed every day, the 8 children killed as a result of unsecured weapons every day. Thoughts and prayers are not enough. And yet, thoughts and prayers is all we have heard from my colleagues on the other side. Thoughts and prayers must lead to action. There may be some question about what the motives were for the killer in Boulder, but there's no mystery about what needs to be done. Connecticut has shown by some of the strongest gun laws in the country that they work. But Connecticut, with those strong gun laws, is at the mercy of states with the weakest laws because guns do not respect state boundaries. This time feels different. The dawn of a new era with a president completely committed to gun violence prevention. And I know from having heard him privately and publicly that he shares this passion. So do majorities now in the House and the Senate. And we have a majority leader in the United States Senate who has promised a vote on constitutional common sense gun violence prevention measures. Our opponents are on their heels, the NRA declaring financial and really moral bankruptcy, and we have, maybe most important, a powerful grassroots movement that has produced results at the polls, wins for members of Congress. And that grassroots movement is led by a new generation of groups and individuals. In the midst of the most serious disease outbreak in our lifetime, gun violence is an epidemic in its own right. Guns in the wrong hands make the most serious problems potentially fatal and irreversible. The hate-motivated shootings that tore through Atlanta last week are just the latest example. They won't be the last. Without access to a weapon, the Atlanta shooter is just a racist and a misogynist. But armed with a firearm, purchased that very day, he is a monster, a mass murderer.